It's day 13 of the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Joining us tonight is Alana Mathews with Prosecutors Alliance. She's a former prosecutor and a law professor at McGeorge School of Law. And Dr. Chistopher Towler, professor of political science at Sac State. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
So let's get right to it. Ms. Mathews, what are you paying attention to as you watch this trial?
Definitely the prosecution's case, because this is somewhat of an anomaly. We know that it's very rare to see police prosecutions brought to trial, and it's even rare to see a conviction. So in many ways, this is sort of a reflection or representation of a paradigm shift in police prosecutions. And I think that's most evidently shown in the number of police witnesses that have testified that the force used by Derek Chauvin was unwarranted. So, there were many police officer witnesses, and they weren't from other jurisdictions. They were from his same department. It was his colleagues, his trainers, superiors, senior officers. So that's going to go a long way. In the past, we've heard about this blue wall of silence, but these officers are speaking out. So that's going to go a long way, I think, to improve or at least counter some of the negative public perceptions of police officers.
Yeah, it has been remarkable. How about you, Dr. Towler? What are you thinking about as you watch this trial unfold?
As I watch the trial unfold, my mind is really thinking about the larger context within which the trial is happening, especially with the recent police shooting that took place outside of Minneapolis just a few days ago. For me, I agree with what Ms. Mathews was saying about the prosecution's emphasis on really trying to hammer this case home. It makes sense that they're doing so, considering the reforms that the Minneapolis Police Department undertook following George Floyd's murder. And to have another incident happen, it's really, for me, the system making sure that it takes care of this one case to prevent further reform and further systemic change, really in further protest. As we've already seen, people are out in the streets in and around Minneapolis, and depending on how this case unfolds, I wouldn't be surprised if people stayed out in the streets or came out in the streets in other areas across the country.
And Dr. Towler, I want to make sure that we pay attention to current events. What do you think about the most recent shooting in Brooklyn Center? How do you think it'll play into this?
I think that it's going to put a lot of pressure on the jury there and the prosecution to make sure that they bring this home for the family of George Floyd and the communities there, and really for Black communities across the country. This case really sits, Trayvon Martin has been the most high profile case that we've seen of police shooting an African-American man. And it's gonna really be important for the national mood and the national tone moving forward that there is some kind of verdict that comes through for the prosecution here, or it could really set up, especially those communities in and around the country that have faced police violence recently, set up a stage where they start to really, really lose faith and hope in the system, or any faith and hope that they had will be gone. If in this case, where there's such massive amount of photographic and videographic evidence, and there's been so much expert testimony on the case, and there still can't get a guilty verdict on this police officer.
And we've been seeing so much of that evidence in court. Going back to court, Ms. Mathews, the state rested yesterday, and now the ball is in the defense's court. In your opinion, how is the defense doing?
Not well. I think two of the last three witnesses that they have put on have been flipped to make the prosecution's case. As a prosecutor, that's exactly what you want to accomplish on cross-examination. It's one thing to discredit a witness, whether it's through impeachment or showing inconsistencies in what they are saying, but it's more profound when you can actually use what they are saying to prove your case. And Jerry Blackwell has been very effective in doing that. I think going into this, Dr. Fowler was viewed as posing the biggest risk to the prosecution's case. He was going to give this expert opinion about death, and instead he just made these broad claims, vague statements, and Jerry Blackwell systemically, methodically just demolished his testimony piece by piece by piece, and just showing the lack of specificity and exposing these baseless assumptions, and actually getting the witness to admit most of his claims were not in his area of expertise.
And it's been very clear that they've been doing their homework. I mean, they always have a response or a case to cite. Let me ask you about the defense's arguments. So far, we've heard them talk about heart condition, Floyd's heart condition, his toxicology, and the threat of the crowd. Have those arguments from the defense been effective?
No, it reminds me of so many cases. I used to always say in closing argument, when the defense can't raise a reasonable doubt, they raise reasonable distractions. And that's essentially what we see the defense doing in talking about the heart condition and the toxicology report, even the mention of the carbon monoxide, which there was no evidence of that even being in his medical report in his system. But I want to make another point too about the questioning.
Ms.
And
Mathews,
the
we're just
implications
about
for the
out of
crowd.
time, so just wrap it up real quick.
Sure. Yeah, just the implications for the crowd. Public safety is a communal responsibility. And I think you have to be very careful when you are mischaracterizing or misstating how a community is responding when they're just showing care and concern for another community member.
Okay, thank you both so much for being with us. We'll have to leave it at that. Good night. Thank you for staying with us as we discuss the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. It's day 13. I'm Mike Duffy. With us is Alana Mathews with the Prosecutors Alliance. She's a former prosecutor and a law professor at McGeorge School of Law, and Dr. Chistopher Towler, professor of political science at Sac State. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, let's get right back to it. Ms. Mathews, today we heard in court for the first time the defense suggests that carbon monoxide poisoning could have contributed to Floyd's death. What do you make of that?
Again, as I say, when you can't raise a reasonable doubt, you raise reasonable distractions. And that was an ineffective argument. I think that Mr. Blackwell did a great job in showing that there was no carbon monoxide in Mr. Floyd's report. There was no evidence, even though he brought up EPA standard numbers, that the limited number of 10 minutes, approximately 10 minutes, affected Mr. Floyd, and even that the car was on. That was another assumption. But what's more striking is that even if you give him those assumptions, why was Mr. Floyd on the ground? It was the defendant who put him there and kept him there if he was indeed exposed to carbon monoxide. Again, proving his case that he failed in his duty of care to lift him up or turn him over to reduce that exposure.
And the state did seem to be able to poke a few holes in that story when they questioned if the car was even on, and the expert had to admit he really didn't know. Mm-hmm. Dr. Towler, how are you looking at, with your expertise as a professor of political science, at this case?
I'm taking a look at this case from sort of a social movement and political engagement perspective. For me, this case fits into years now of very high profile police shootings of African-American men and women that have sparked protests and unrest in those cities and across the country. Since George Floyd's murder, there has been numerous protests that have been built on the back of that, and many would argue that the movement itself following George Floyd's murder influenced the 2020 election and sort of energized especially African-American voters in the Black community around getting someone in office that actually had some sympathy, if not support, for their movement against police violence. In the Black Lives Matter movement has played a large role in bringing awareness to those issues in local chapters organizing across the country. And so as I look at this case, I'm trying to understand how this case may fit within that larger narrative of social movements, and whether this case is going to be sort of that spark that might push things forward to continue to keep people engaged and thinking about these issues, or if this case might be a turning point that brings people back into a trustworthy state and might actually believe in the system a bit more following this. And so to me, this could be a turning point in sort of this narrative of police violence against Black men and women, to a point where it could affect politics in the long run as to how engaged Black people are, how interested in politics they are, and how sort of upset or angry at the system they are moving forward.
So sort of a litmus test.
Absolutely. It's becoming a more communal effort. I just want to echo what Dr. Towler said. It's just bigger than this case. It's really an indication of how we're going to move forward as a country.
Yeah, sort of a litmus test, I was going to say, for if, as everybody's been saying, it feels different, if this case actually makes a difference, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think even if there is a guilty verdict with the recent shooting outside of Minneapolis, there's still going to be questions raised. And so The guilty verdict will absolutely help sort of community relations between police and underrepresented minorities and people who they are supposed to be policing in a peaceful, protective manner. It will help those relationships, but it's going to do far more harm than it will do good if the verdict comes back and there are no consequences for the officer Chauvin's killing of George Floyd. With the recent killing that happened during the trial, an acquittal or any type of verdict that lets sort of in the view of these communities lets the officer off can absolutely break down the relationship between police and communities and relationship between these communities and their trust in the system to a new degree.
Dr. Towler, you just made me think, do you think that something has changed, at least in the minds of police officers? I mean, is this in the back of their mind nowadays?
You would hope so. The contextual evidence, though, and the anecdotal evidence suggests it's not. Since the George Floyd trial has started, there have been at least a half dozen police shootings across the country, one of which took place in the community that the trial was happening. I think it's 20 miles or so from where the actual trial is being held. And so really the trial itself may speak to the problem, but there is a much larger sort of systemic and institutional problem with policing that needs to be addressed through not just reform, but also through creative rethinking about how police are used and the authority and the weapons that are bestowed upon police to protect and serve communities that they oftentimes don't have a strong relationship to and are not from. And so even though the trial is there and is front and center and has our minds on these issues, there are deeper issues that the trial represents that are not necessarily being talked about in ways that can really create new change and a new mentality about policing moving forward.
So, Ms. Mathews, I want to ask you, I know that, this is what a lot of people say, but it's hard to gauge. Which way do you think at this point the verdict will go?
That's really a difficult question to answer because you never know. I mean, certainly there have been other cases in the past, going back to even Rodney King, where it would seem that there was clear and convincing evidence that showed excessive force, and the jury still voted to acquit. So I think the prosecution in this case recognizes the extreme amount of deference that most individuals give to police officers. And so, in fact, in this case, they've mentioned that every witness or every potential juror was asked the question of how they feel about police officers, and everyone indicated that they do respect officers. And I think that's probably part of the reasons why the defense decided to take this to trial. So the deference that we give police officers, that's being recognized, and that's going to be a significant factor in ultimately the jury's decision. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Dr. Towler, do you want to take a stab at that?
I agree completely with Dr. Mathews' perspective. There's really no way to tell at this point. The juries themselves, although they're sequestered, are definitely aware of and most likely influenced by the outside context that's taking place. And so knowing that there's pressure on them to make a decision one way or the other, while also knowing that in this case in particular, the jury selection process was long and tedious to try and make sure that there were jurors on there that did not have any anti-police bias or vice versa. It's really going to be left up to the jury in many ways, up to their sort of personal opinions about the case and how good they are at convincing one another one way or the other. And so at this point, I'm not confident enough to take a stab at the actual verdict.
I don't blame you.
I think the prosecution has done a great job of separating Derek Chauvin and his actions from the general context of police officers. And certainly all the witnesses who took the stand definitely made that distinction.
All right, and I also want to put this in some historical context. Dr. Floyd, how significant is this trial and how does it compare to other race and policing trials?
You said Dr. Floyd. I think you were referring to the
Dr. Towler.
defendant.
Dr. Towler, my mistake.
I think this trial is very, very significant simply due to the nature of the protest and unrest that followed the actual killing of George Floyd and how that influenced and impacted the society as a whole. I mean, here in Sacramento, businesses were shut down with the combination of the George Floyd protests and COVID for weeks after the actual initial protest started, and there were businesses and shops boarded up, closed down, almost like society had to take a break from everything due to the unrest and the fear of protest and things getting violent and possibly destroyed. And so the anger and the in some ways energy that came from the initial passing and killing of George Floyd is still there. It's still in the air, and it's still very, very thick, and you can feel it. And so I think this trial is going to be very, very significant in understanding sort of how policing moves forward in the future.
And Ms. Mathews, I wanted to give you a chance to also respond to, what would you say to somebody who says this sort of thing couldn't happen in our area in Sacramento?
Well, I would say it's up to us to make sure that it doesn't happen. We talked about how this trial is probably one of the most important in the century for the country, but we also have to look at how is it important in our community, and how are we all going to collectively take responsibility, move forward, and as Dr. Towler said, begin to rethink, reimagine public safety, community, safety and security for all of the members of our community. We certainly need to do that, and we need to make sure that we have leadership and systems and public members who are all supporting that. So it's a moment for us to move forward, but it's also a moment for us to come together, connect, and move forward as one community.
I think that's great advice. All right, I'll leave it at that. My guest tonight, Dr. Chistopher Towler, professor of political science at Sac State, and Alana Mathews, former prosecutor, currently with Prosecutors Alliance. Thank you both for joining us.